There are now over 30 billion farm animals living on our planet, dozens of times more than wild ones. Cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, they exist because we raise them. But what would happen if, tomorrow, all of humanity suddenly stopped eating meat? Something like that's already happened in Canada with a hybrid of domestic pigs and wild boars. Canadian farmers bred them back in the 1980s to sell their meat to exotic restaurants. But when the market collapsed, farmers simply opened the gates and let the animals go. They thought the pigs would die, but those creatures turned out to be smarter, stronger, and tougher than anyone expected. Today, they're called the most invasive animals on the planet. They survive minus 40-degree winters, eat everything from roots and trash to fawns and birds, dig up the ground like excavators, and destroy crops. In some Canadian provinces, they're already impossible to eradicate. Scientists record tens of thousands of sightings, and now they're about to cross the border and start spreading across the U.S. That's actually a small case, just a few thousand pigs out of 30 billion farm animals. But things like this are happening not only in Canada, but all over the world. And what are the consequences? Well, you'll find out after the intro. Time of the Wild. An unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. There's the biggest sheep farm in the world in Australia. Just look at the photo. All the way to the horizon, an endless sea of sheep. Its area is over 2.5 million acres. That's a tenth of Iceland's territory, only instead of people, there are 87,000 sheep. 248 miles of fences to keep wild dogs out, hundreds of workers, a whole infrastructure regulating the life cycle of animals. There are thousands of such farms in Australia, home to some 79 million sheep. But before we get to releasing all these sheep, we shouldn't miss one important detail. Domesticated animals are very different from wild ones, and not just because they live near humans, but because we made them this way. For centuries, or even millennia, people have been selectively breeding the traits they wanted, like calm temperament, more wool, more milk, less aggression. And as a result, we ended up with animals that can hardly survive without humans. And if all these domesticated fellows suddenly found themselves in the wild, their advantages could quickly turn into disadvantages. I mean, yes, for some it might help them survive, but for others, it would be a death sentence. Take sheep, for example. The animals bred specifically for their wool, they need to be sheared regularly, once or twice a year. If not, the wool grows so much that it becomes a threat to the animal itself. Originally, sheep came from mouflons, wild mountain sheep. It's simple for them. They grow thick wool for the winter, shed the extra in summer, and live happily. But humans kept breeding sheep so persistently that they eventually lost the ability to shed. That's why people say domestic sheep can't survive without humans. There's even a real case, a sheep named Shrek from New Zealand who became a celebrity in 2004. He hid from people and avoided shearing for 6 years straight. Usually, merino sheep are sheared once a year, but Shrek apparently lived in caves, dodging humans entirely. When he was finally caught on April 15, 2004, they held a big shearing event live on TV 2 weeks later. In just 29 minutes, they took off 59 pounds of wool, enough for 20 men's suits. For comparison, normally a single sheep gives around 10 pounds. And just imagine how hard it must be to carry that much extra weight. It's usually a huge stress for the animal. And not just because of the heat, it's literally a life-threatening situation. After shearing, sheep often have trouble walking because they're used to hauling around dozens of pounds of wool. Without it, they feel like their bodies suddenly became too light and unstable. You know that feeling when you take off heavy boots and put on something light, like sandals? Now imagine that over your entire body. Plus, when there's too much wool, sheep start overheating, have trouble seeing and finding food. And Shrek's case was an extraordinary stroke of luck. Most sheep wouldn't survive that long. They simply wouldn't make it. But what if several sheep were abandoned at once? Turns out there's a real story like that. This is Campbell Island in the Southern Ocean, owned by New Zealand. In the late 19th century, anyone could rent a piece of land there, start a farm, build something, raise animals, whatever you liked. And of course, a few thousand sheep were brought in. Before that, the island was almost empty, just a chunk of land in the middle of the ocean covered in grass and thorny bushes. At first, everything went great. There was plenty of food, thick grass, no predators, no competition. In short, a sheep paradise. But by 1913, the herd had grown to 7,000 or 8,000 head. But then wool prices collapsed so badly that keeping the farm no longer made sense. People just packed up and left, and the sheep stayed. And that's when things started to get weird. At first, their numbers dropped sharply. Obviously, they'd eaten all the food. Then, unexpectedly, the population began to grow again. How did that happen? Simple. Only the toughest survived. Some researchers believe that when humans left the island, the sheep faced a real crisis. We've seen a similar case with Shrek, the sheep that almost died because it wasn't shorn for years. Now imagine thousands of Shreks on one island. No one to help to shear them or even remove the excess wool. No wonder many just couldn't handle it. But there were tougher animals too, or those whose wool was thinner, which made life a bit easier without human care. Over time, these sheep began to breed, and their offspring inherited traits better suited to living in the wild. Gradually, the herd changed, becoming more and more adapted, because that's exactly how fast evolution works. At first, they weren't ready for life without people, so the death rate was enormous. Only those who managed to survive all the hardships reproduced, and with each new generation, the sheep became tougher and more resilient. Were they lucky? Maybe. They could have gone completely extinct since human selection had made them too dependent, but instead they started to regain what they'd once lost, their wild instincts and natural abilities. You could say that's a kind of luck. And the most interesting part is that those sheep went on living on the island for another 40 years, forming a new, unique breed. When people finally came back, they found a herd that had already learned to live on its own. And that's just one tiny island and a small group of animals that humans once set free. Tiny on a planetary scale, of course. Now imagine if all animals were released into the wild. That's a whole different question. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there are now more than 1 billion cows in the world. Domestic sheep aren't far behind. There are also over 1 billion of them. That makes them the most numerous type of sheep on the planet. We have roughly the same number of domestic pigs, about 1 billion. So pigs are among the most widespread large mammals in the world. But chickens are the real leaders here. Their population keeps growing every year. In 2000, there were about 14 billion chickens. By 2021, almost 26 billion. And according to data from 2022, around 26.5 billion. Now imagine if, for some reason, humanity suddenly lost interest in farming and all pens and barns on Earth were thrown open and over 30 billion animals would pour out into the wild. That's almost 4 times the human population. 30 billion creatures, and every one of them has to eat. Every day, several times a day. And that's where the problem begins. There simply isn't enough food in nature to sustain them all. Sure, they could forage on their own without humans, but not on the scale needed to feed 30 billion animals. Today, nearly half of all habitable land, 44%, is used for agriculture. The total area is enormous, about 18.5 million square miles. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 5 times the size of the United States. About 2/3 of that area is pastures, and 1/3 is land where they grow crops. But only half of all cropland is used to grow food for people. The rest goes to biofuel, industrial products, or mostly animal feed. Feeding all the domestic animals on Earth today takes about 9.6 million square miles, nearly half of all farmland on the planet. Just think about that scale. Millions of people work every day to keep this system running, feeding, breeding, transporting. It's an enormous effort for humans, and we're much smarter and more capable than cows. So there's no way all these animals could possibly feed themselves if left without humans. The issue isn't whether cows, pigs, or chickens could survive in the wild. Some of them probably could. The real issue is that there just wouldn't be enough food for all of them. If humans were to suddenly walk away, abandon the farms, the fields, the feed, the care, billions of animals would just starve. Only a few small groups, lucky enough to find themselves in suitable environments, might manage to escape into the wild and, over time, become feral like the sheep on Campbell Island once did. But actually, there are a few possible scenarios, a few ways this could go. And I'll start perhaps with the pigs, those mentioned at the beginning of this video. Pigs aren't actually native to North America, but they've been roaming the continent for centuries. The real trouble for Canada began only in the 1980s when farmers were encouraged to start breeding wild boars. Back then, it seemed like a good business: meat, hunting, export. But by 2001, the market had collapsed, and many farmers simply gave up. Some literally took down the fences, opened the gates, and let the animals go. Like, you're on your own now, guys. As it often happens with boars, some of them escaped anyway. They dug under the ground, broke through the wire, or smashed through barriers. And so the animals once bred for food ended up in the wild. And here's the thing. We're not talking about ordinary pigs. To make the business more profitable, farmers started crossing domestic pigs with wild boars, trying to create a kind of improved version, bigger, more meat, easier to hunt. That's how the so-called super pigs came to be. And nobody was too worried. Experts confidently claimed that escaped domestic animals wouldn't survive a Canadian winter. They'd just freeze. End of story. Yeah, as if. The pigs quickly proved just how wrong those experts were. They turned out to be far tougher than anyone imagined. Now the descendants of those boars live all across western and central Canada, from British Columbia to Manitoba and beyond. As they spread, they cause real havoc, digging up fields, destroying meadows, ruining soil, chasing livestock, and eating pretty much anything they find. These wild runaways can weigh up to 595 pounds. Armed with sharp tusks and bristly hair over a thick undercoat, they breed fast and keep expanding their range. Mixing with domestic breeds gave them a set of traits that made them almost indestructible: resistance to cold and the ability to produce large litters. In short, super pigs in every sense. Since the pig problem in Canada is still relatively new, many of its consequences haven't even fully kicked in yet. But one thing's already clear: those famous Canadian winters don't stop them at all. These animals turned out much smarter and hardier than anyone expected. Thanks to their size and ingenuity, they handle freezing cold just fine. One of their survival tricks is digging tunnels under the snow, literally burrows that stay warm and safe. But the biggest concern now isn't just ruined fields or displaced wildlife, it's the massive economic damage. In the US, for example, wild boars cause an estimated $2.5 billion in losses every year. Imagine how much they can manage to dig up and destroy if even the cold can't stop them. And worst of all, boars breed insanely fast. One sow can give birth to 6 piglets at a time and do it twice a year, which means their numbers will keep growing even if 60 to 70% of them are wiped out every year. What about hunting? It barely helps. Hunters' success rate is only 2 to 3%. In some US states, hunting was even banned because it only made things worse. Boars got more cautious, switched to a nocturnal lifestyle, and now hide better than ever. So what's the result? Feral pigs, former domestic ones crossed with wild boars, have turned into a massive million-strong problem. People have spent years, tons of money, and enormous effort, but it's barely made a difference. Everything suggests these animals are here to stay in North America and will keep causing trouble for a very long time. Especially since, as humanity, we already know how this goes. Because the boar situation isn't the first or only one in history. Ever heard of the Australian feral camels? They were brought here back in the 19th century, and now Australia has to live with the consequences. Today, this country is home to the largest feral camel population in the world. By different estimates, anywhere from a few 100,000 to over 1 million animals. Females can give birth every 2 years and live up to 40, so their numbers grow fast. Roughly speaking, the population doubles every 9 years. An average camel weighs close to a half ton or more, and they roam in huge herds from a dozen to several hundred. Wherever they go, everything suffers. Plants are trampled, infrastructure gets damaged, and food sources disappear. Because camels eat everything they can find, competing with both livestock and other wild animals. They also deprive local Aboriginal communities of food, for whom plants and water in these regions are a matter of survival. Water, in fact, is the main source of conflict. When there are moisture-rich plants around, camels can go without drinking for weeks. But once drought hits, that's it. They become obsessed with water. One adult camel can drink up to 50 gallons a day, and when natural sources dry up, they'll look for water anywhere. On Aboriginal land, at farms, and towns. Along the way, they break pipes, destroy toilets, and even knock air conditioners out of windows. And to understand why there are wild camels in Australia in the first place, you need to go back to the beginning, to how they got here. In the 1830s, British colonists tried to explore the Australian outback on horseback. But horses tired quickly, unable to handle the heat and long distances. Then the colonists heard of animals that could walk on sand for weeks without water and decided to give them a try. The first camel arrived in Australia in 1840 from the Canary Islands. Then more came from Arabia, Afghanistan, India, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. Along with the animals came those who knew how to handle them, more than 2,000 cameleers. And camels turned out to be indispensable. They helped explore the interior, carried food, water, and equipment. They transported gold miners and workers who built railways and telegraph lines. Without camels, settling such a desert country would have been almost impossible. But over time, everything changed. In 1901, Australia passed a law restricting the entry of non-Europeans. Because of that, the number of cameleers dropped sharply. Then came machinery, trucks, trains, roads. By the 1930s, horses and camels simply weren't needed anymore. Many cameleers went back home, leaving about 10,000 camels behind, without work and without supervision. Sounds familiar? The same thing already happened with pigs in Canada and sheep in New Zealand. As long as animals were useful, people bred and used them. But once the profit was gone, they were just abandoned. And just like with the feral pigs of North America, the camel problem turned out to be very serious and hard to solve, if it can be solved at all. In 2009, Australia launched a large-scale program to control the feral camel population. They allocated 19 million Australian dollars for it, and by 2013, around 160,000 animals had been culled. This helped reduce their numbers to about 300,000. But then came the heat, drought, and the 2019-2020 bushfires, and everything had to start over again. Desperate for food and water, many camels began to move toward human settlements. Remote Aboriginal communities suffered the most. The animals broke fences, stormed watering points, and destroyed supplies. That's when the Department of Environment and Water of South Australia announced an emergency 5-day culling operation. It was the first such case in the region. Professional marksmen shot from helicopters, killing between 4,000 and 5,000 camels. And here's the thing, this problem isn't going anywhere. Wiping out all the animals is simply impossible. First, it wouldn't be humane. Second, it's practically impossible. The country is enormous, and the camels live in remote, hard-to-reach areas. There are no predators to keep their numbers in check, and camels breed quite fast. So now Australia has only one option left, to carry out regular culls to keep the population under control. And that costs a lot of money. More than $13 million have already been spent, and that number will only keep growing. This is yet another example of what can happen when domestic animals are released into the wild. A very, very costly one. But there's another path. Not death, not territorial takeover, and not the creation of crazy hybrids. And that path is the Przewalski's horse. It's a short, stocky animal with a thick, upright mane and a really nasty temper. Because of that, Przewalski's horses are often compared to zebras. They live in the steppes of Europe and Asia. That is, in vast open plains without trees, where summer temperatures can reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit and winters can drop to minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit. For a long time, this species, or subspecies depending on whom you ask, was considered the last true wild horse on Earth. That's why so many conservation groups have been fighting to protect it. Scientists from major institutions like the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute created programs to bring Przewalski's horses back into the wild, for example in reserves in China and Mongolia. But their journey wasn't easy. In 1969, Przewalski's horses were officially declared extinct in the wild. They were saved from complete disappearance only thanks to small groups kept in zoos and reserves. Today, there are around 2,000 of them left. And then something interesting happened. In 2018, a study came out that completely changed how we see this species. Scientists tested the DNA of Przewalski's horses, compared it to the bones of ancient horses, and discovered that these animals aren't actually true wild horses as people used to think. They turned out to be descendants of domesticated horses that once escaped from humans and, over time, adapted to living in the wild again. In other words, they're not a vanished ancient species, but the result of a reverse process. The study revealed a surprising twist. Przewalski's horses turned out to be descendants of one of the oldest groups of domesticated horses, the Batai horses. These horses lived in northern Kazakhstan about 5,500 years ago. For researchers, that was quite a surprise. Archaeologists originally wanted to prove that Bataille horses were the ancestors of modern domestic horses, but it turned out to be the opposite. DNA analysis showed that Bataille horses didn't give rise to today's domestic breeds. Instead, Przewalski's horses descended from them. To reach this conclusion, scientists fully decoded the genomes of 20 Bataille horses and 22 other ancient horses from across Eurasia. Then they compared that DNA with modern and other ancient samples, and here's what they found. The Bataille horses were early domesticated animals, and Przewalski's horses are their descendants, the ones that ran away and became wild again. Before the Bataille settlements appeared, the region was inhabited by nomads, hunters, and gatherers. Around 5,500 years ago, they started taming horses, at first probably using them as a source of meat, and later as a means of transport. And somewhere along the way, some of those tamed animals simply ran off back into the steppe. So the Przewalski's horses, long thought to be the last true wild horses, are actually former domestic animals. They just left humans a few thousand years ago and managed to adapt. But what's the point here? Well, imagine if today's chickens or sheep escaped and lived in the wild for a couple thousand years. Their descendants might also be seen as true wild animals. And then one day, someone would take a DNA sample and be really surprised to learn the truth. So does that mean domestic animals can survive if released into the wild and left without human care? Many species were domesticated thousands of years ago, and it feels like they couldn't survive without us. Sheep, chickens, cows, all these creatures are so closely tied to people that it's hard to picture them in the wild. So the idea seems obvious. Without humans, farm animals are doomed. But let's test that. Let's open the gate, let the cows out, and see what happens next. In a real-life example. We're heading to the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. There's an island called Chirikov, a chunk of land in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska, about the size of 2 Manhattans and some 80 miles southwest of Kodiak Island. Kodiak is a tourist spot. People go there for fishing, hunting, and of course the brown bear. It's one of the largest land predators on Earth, and it lives right there, on that archipelago. But on Chirikov Island, there are no bears. And no people either. What it does have is cattle. Right now, over 2,000 cows and bulls live on that island. Chirikov Island is part of a U.S. wildlife refuge, and opinions about these animals are split. Some see them as a harmful invasive species, outsiders who disturb the local ecosystem. Others say they're already true residents of the island. After all, they've lived there for over 200 years. The story goes back to the time when Alaska still belonged to Russia. The Russians brought cows and bulls here to start farming. Then in 1867, Alaska was sold to the United States and the cattle were simply left behind. But the real father of local ranching is considered to be a man named Jack McCord. He was a farmer from Iowa, an experienced trader, and a gold prospector in Alaska. In the 1920s, he landed on Kodiak Island and heard rumors that somewhere nearby on Chirikov Island, a wild herd was roaming free. And of course, he immediately realized he could make a business out of it. McCord bought the herd from the company that technically owned it, but soon he found out the federal government was planning to declare those animals wild and take them under control, so he decided to act. In 1927, Jack McCord managed to lobby the U.S. Congress, with support from Western politicians, to create legislation that allowed privately owned livestock to graze public lands. He then brought new bulls to Chirikov Island to freshen the blood of the herd and balance its numbers, but soon things got out of control. By 1939, he had around 1,500 semi-feral cows, too many to handle, and far too many bulls that kept fighting each other. The weather didn't help either. Storms, wind, rain, all of it scared away the hunters McCord had hired to cull the herd. In the end, he found only 5 desperate men willing to take the risk. They set out for the island and lost. The expedition failed, and by 1950, McCord gave up. But the story didn't end there. The same pattern repeated again and again. Different people, same mistake. Each one thought he could tame the island and make a fortune. And now, almost a century later, a wild herd still roams Chirikov Island, and it's become a problem. The cattle graze the vegetation down to bare soil, dig up the ground with their hooves, and walking along the same trails, gradually destroy the coastline. Chunks of land simply crumble into the sea. Recent aerial surveys showed about 600 to 800 living animals and around 200 to 250 dead ones. The carcasses were still there, skin and hair partly preserved, and less than a third had been touched by scavengers. Meanwhile, the local foxes looked very well fed, and some were even living inside the carcasses. Most likely, the cattle died of starvation. There are no predators on the island, so the herd grows until it hits the limit, and then a harsh winter wipes many of them out. After that, the cycle starts all over again. One eyewitness said the island was just covered with bones everywhere. Tibias, femurs, shoulder blades, skulls, horns, teeth. I'm not sure I've ever seen so many bones in one place. The first conclusion is obvious. In isolated environments like Chirikov Island, many domestic animals can survive perfectly well on their own. Humans, in fact, aren't really necessary as long as there's space and food. The second takeaway, this kind of thing isn't rare at all. There are plenty of stories where, after human activity on remote islands, domestic animals were left behind and later went feral. It happens again and again. On all kinds of islands, from Alaska to New Zealand, from the Galapagos to California, you can find both true wild animals and descendants of domestic ones. This phenomenon even has a name: feralization. Eradicating or removing such livestock is a common practice. Back in the day, many islands were deliberately settled with animals during colonization or the exploration of new territories. Livestock were often just left unattended, and it began to live by its own rules and gradually change. The animals created unique conditions for natural selection and random genetic mutations. Sometimes these herds descend from breeds that no longer exist on the mainland. But there's also a predictable problem. When large herbivores like cows or goats end up on an island with no predators, they start breeding uncontrollably. At some point, there are more animals than the island can feed. That leads to overgrazing. Plants disappear, the soil erodes, and local species suffer because there's simply no space left for them. This photo was taken on Chirikov Island. Researchers fenced off a patch of vegetation to show what the land might look like without cows. The difference, of course, is dramatic. And finally, the third conclusion. Everything depends on countless factors. With islands, it's clear the sheep and cows had nothing threatening them, so they managed to survive without people. But on the mainland, the situation is completely different. Imagine releasing all the cows in North America into the wild right now. They'd scatter across the plains and forests, and very soon they'd run into bears, wolves, cougars, even coyotes. And those encounters would clearly not go in the cows' favor. Without humans, they'd be vulnerable, unprepared for predators, unable to defend themselves, poorly adapted to harsh winters and droughts. They'd have to compete for food with local wildlife, deer, moose, bison, and then their survival would depend on 1,000 random chances. Where they end up, how many there are, how much water and grass they find, whether the weather is kind. And in that kind of battle for existence, domestic animals might not stand a chance at all. You owe me a like. See you later.